I'm going to read a few verses from Paul's letter, the 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 31. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. Now, last time I spoke in a meeting here at Albert Road was in May, and those who were present or seen it on Zoom, I had arrived back in England in November 1976 after being 6.5 years in Uruguay. I must admit, it was a bit of a shock to come back to the cold of an English winter after leaving the hot of the South American summer. In those early days, I spent time with my parents who lived in Buckinghamshire and also at the WEC headquarters, which was the mission I was serving with, which was not very far away from High Wycombe in Gerrards Cross, also in Buckinghamshire. At that stage, I had no idea what the next assignment was going to be. And at times I was a bit apprehensive and puzzled. I just knew that I would not be returning to Uruguay with the same mission WEC. Soon after I arrived home, a young lady who I'd been friendly with came to visit me, and she hinted she wanted to revive the friendship. I was not expecting this and really did not know how to answer. Without being too harsh on her, I said to her that if she felt called to full-time mission life and work, then she should seek the Lord and his guidance. For my part, although uncertain about the future, I did not have any leading to remain in the UK, and as a result, nothing further developed. But over the years, I'd actually had different situations, and there were plenty of opportunities when I could have been, if that had been my desire, seeking a wife. I personally had never made that a priority or a condition to serve the Lord. I guess in some ways, with the background that I had, I was a little bit apprehensive about marriage and family. Being one of 14 children, we didn't always have the best of everything, and it was not easy. So it was not a priority in my case. And while I was attending and involved with the youth group at High Wycombe, there were several young ladies there. In fact, over the years, I think I had 2 kind of friendships, but none of them were really anything more than for convenience in some ways, not with a long-term view in mind. Then at Bible College, obviously, there were single ladies there. They could have been candidates, possibilities. At the mission headquarters, there were young ladies there, but if they were going off to Africa and I was going to South America, or they were going to one part of the world and I was going somewhere else, that was not an option either. Even when I got to South America, there were plenty of opportunities. I could have met Miss Wright in one of the situations there. I knew of several missionaries who had gone out as single workers, had fallen in love and married national workers or other missionaries. Some were still there, some had left the mission. And on a few occasions when I was in different situations, there were a few hints and suggestions of likely candidates who I might consider approaching, and I was never really led to follow up on anything at all, any of those. As I say, I knew some missionaries who had married nationals. There was one lady who went out with the CLC and married a Uruguayan, at least Armenian in Uruguay, and stayed there. There was a Scottish lady who was a missionary with WEC, married a national and stayed there. So it was a possibility. There were options there. But it was not my desire or my priority. So after a period of rest back in the UK, arriving, as I say, in November 1976, I was involved in quite a lot of activities and different things that needed to be done. Obviously, there were medical checks and things like that that needed to be attended to. And I became involved with the ministry at the WEC headquarters near Gerrards Cross. Now, at some point, I'm not quite sure exactly when, but I was invited by the WEC people to go to what was then a conference centre based in Kilcreggan on the Clyde in Scotland. The manager approached me and asked if I would go to work at the conference centre for the period of the summer in 1977. I had actually been there on a previous occasions when I was in Scotland, so I knew the premises, I knew the location, I knew what was involved. So it was March the 24th, 1977, that my dad took me to High Wycombe railway station to catch a train into London bound for Scotland. I got the coach at Victoria Coach Station, 8:10 in the morning, and arrived in Glasgow about 6 o'clock in the evening. I went to the WEC Bible College, which was based in Glasgow, and a couple of days later, one of the staff took me across to the conference centre in Kilcreggan. I spent several months there and was kept very busy. My diary records occasions when I may have been fixing a vehicle. One day it says I was fixing the brakes, replacing the brake pads on a Morris Minor. Another one says I was trying to fix a tractor, and all kinds of maintenance jobs that were needing doing at the mission conference centre. I remember one of the big jobs I had was to paint the iron fencing all the way around the front of the property. I've always been involved with painting, and I must admit I quite enjoy it. It's quite therapeutic, and I try and do the best I can. So I guess that was probably still the green that I painted it for a number of years after that. There was also other practical things that were going on there. Accommodation at the site, there were probably 1,000 visitors over the 6 weeks of the conference, but about 100 could be accommodated on site. So there were chalets and rooms and things that needed to be prepared for the conference. I recall that I went with Don Wilson, the manager, to what was then Her Majesty's Naval Base at Faslane on the Gairloch on the River Clyde, which, if anybody knows, it's the nuclear submarine base on the Clyde. And he had bought some felt for roofs and carpets for chalets and other things, and we went down to collect them. And so I was involved in re-roofing chalets, carpeting floors, repairing beds, bedding, all kinds of things on a practical level, including mowing lawns, cutting hedges on the extensive grounds around the place. At one stage, Mr. Wilson asked me if I would build a tuck shop. So, along with some other helpers, this was undertaken during April and May. It was about the size of a normal garden shed. I'd never built anything like it before, but we got together and we managed to build a pretty good tuck shop with an opening section so that people could come along and buy their goodies when it was open. And that actually lasted for a good number of years, so it was a pretty good job. I was quite pleased with that. It was during those 6 weeks of the actual conference that there were other responsibilities that I had. I was responsible for organising trips for the visitors through the centre. We used to hire a coach from a local bus company, a coach company. Some days we would go out for trips around the countryside. Other times we hired a boat from a local boat company and had trips down the Clyde and around the islands. And I was responsible for organising and bookings and all the rest of it, catering and all that for that kind of activity. One of the main reasons, of course, was not just to do practical work, but I was there to represent the WEC as a conference speaker. at the annual missionary conferences. So I was involved in all kinds of other spiritual activities, if you like, including prayer times, devotional messages, missionary reports, and with the changing personnel at the different weeks of the conference, I had many opportunities to share of the work of WEC, as it was then, with different groups of people and supporters of WEC. However, there was quite a challenge coming up, which was completely unknown to me. One of the ladies of the mission had written a little play about the founder of the mission, who was a man by the name of C.T. Studd. Now, he was from a very wealthy family. He was, in fact, a very well-educated Cambridge graduate. He was a famous cricketer. I think he played for England. I'm not absolutely sure of that, but he was a very rich, very well-educated, popular man. But the Lord called him to mission service, and he gave up everything and went eventually to 3 different continents to preach the gospel. And he was the one who started the mission WEC, as it became called. It first of all started off as Heart of Africa Mission in the Congo, but it became known as WEC, Worldwide Evangelization Crusade. Now, this lady prepared this play about his life, and I was asked to take on the part of C.T. Studd. So a little bit of acting practice, and we presented this play. Now, one of his most famous quotes was, "If Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him." He gave up everything to follow the Lord. After we'd done this play, the next day, for some strange reason, the manager said to me, there were some people who responded to that play last night, and one of them was a young lady called Joan. So, who was Joan? Let's find out.
I was born in Upminster, Essex, one of 7 children. I was the 5th. My dad worked as a goods shunter with the British Railways in Upminster. The day before my 5th birthday, he was knocked down by a train and killed. When I was around 7 years old, that's just guesswork, I can't remember exactly. When I was around 7 years old, we moved from Upminster to Streatham in London. And as far as I can remember, my childhood was fairly normal. I know I joined the St. John Ambulance Brigade as a cadet, as a junior cadet, and continued on there until I was quite older. But before that happened, my 3 eldest sisters and my brother went to a special type of boarding school, not an orphanage, but it was recognised for single parents or something like that. When my eldest sister left at the age of 15, I took her place at the boarding school, which I can't remember too much about it, and I wasn't there all that long. But I left school at 15 and worked in an office until I was old enough to go to college and train as a nursery nurse. Because that's something I always wanted to do, look after children. I did the practical training at a day nursery in Streatham. I was fine with the practical work, but not with the academic side of things. And I didn't pass the exam. So I remained at the nursery as a nursery assistant. One day, as around 1960, my mum came across a notice in a local newspaper that said, "Welcome to Streatham Baptist Church." Responding to this, she started attending services and activities at the church, which was in walking distance from our home. Mind you, in those days it was quite customary. It was part and parcel of your life. You went to Sunday school and you went to church, because in those days there was no shops open or anything like that. So it's part and parcel of life to go to Sunday school. My mum came to know the Lord as her Saviour. At the time, I was living at home with Mum and my two younger twin sisters. And we went with my mum to the church. On the July the 24th, 1966, I had accepted Jesus as my personal saviour and was baptised at Lewin Road Baptist Church. I can remember that. I can remember going backwards, and choking. Came up spluttering. I remember there was also a friend of my mum's who every Christmas used to give us Christian books. She used to give my sister Mary books about nursing, and mine was always missionary-orientated books. Not academic books, but about people's lives and what they did overseas. But the change in my life, in my Christian life, took place on Monday, September the 13th, 1971. To me, it was a turning point in my life. We had at that day a visit from Arthur Blessed of the Jesus movement. He was well known in those days for traveling the country, carrying a wooden cross and boldly proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ for the salvation of sinners. And it was at this time that the words from Jeremiah 29:11 was given to me. And this is, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." That's taken from the New Living Translation. I remember seeking the Lord, what do I do with my life? I was challenged about taking a course at a Bible college in order to be better prepared to serve the Lord. Before this happened, somebody came at the church at Lewin Road, came up to me and said, "I believe the Lord wants you to be a missionary." I thought, me? But the more I thought about it and prayed about it, I made some inquiries. I applied to the Bible Training Institute in Glasgow. They didn't insist that you have to have lots of academic qualifications, but they recommend you get in the English language, English GCSE. So, as a test, I went to night school and studied English language. And for the first time in my life, I passed an exam. I've actually got 1 GCE. However, I do remember hesitating quite a few weeks before being brave enough to send off my application to BTI. But I did eventually apply and was accepted and went on the 3-year course from 1973 to 1976. What do I do when I finished? I had no idea. I know I didn't want to go back home and just work in a church. I felt in my heart the Lord wanted me to work with children. At the time, I didn't think God wanted to work with me. I was in my 30s, single, without a boyfriend on the horizon, willing to go anywhere God wanted me to go, but at the same time scared of going anywhere alone. I felt in my heart called to work with children, so I did a 3-month training course with the Child Evangelism Fellowship in Switzerland. On return from that, went back to Paisley. I worked in a school for children with cerebral palsy, but I realised I couldn't cope with that one. And then a friend said to me, "How about helping out at Kilcraven Conference Centre?" I was out of work at it was at Kilcraven, run by the Worldwide Evangelization Crusade Conference. I was out of work at the time, so I made contact with the managers there and was taken on as a volunteer for the summer of 1977. While I was at Kilcraven, I heard about the work of CLC, which is Christian Literature Crusade, and learned about CLC Uruguay. Guess who I met there? Tony was taking on part of the annual missionary convention. Having served in Uruguay with WEC, he was about to begin the process of transferring to CLC. Over to you now. I'm sure a lot of you, if you've had to think back all these years, it's hard to put down on paper. I mean, Tony's got piles and piles of diaries. I haven't. So it's a lonely track, keep putting my brain into gear. Over to you.
Joan says she was actually volunteering and she was helping in the kitchens at the Kilcraven Centre. And the day after, this guy said to me, this young lady, Joan, responded to dedicate her life to Christian service. Well, the kitchen, I was actually staying in a caravan just almost adjacent to the kitchen window. So the next day I found myself listening to see if I could hear a voice from the kitchen. It was rather strange, but it was one of those things that you can't explain how suddenly things clicked. The first time we actually went for a walk was one early evening, and I casually remarked I was going to blow the cobwebs away. And that wasn't directly an invitation, but Joan proceeded to go to her room, collected her coat, and we walked along one of the roads overlooking the River Clyde in Kilcreggan. Over the following weeks, I got to know Joan, and quite quickly, something seemed to click between us. If she could get free from the kitchen, she would come on the trips and help with various tasks. It was almost by coincidence that Joan's mum and two friends from the Baptist Church in Streatham were at that conference that week. I actually collected Joan's mum from the ferry, took her up to the lodgings, and so I met her mum and her two friends within a few days of meeting Joan herself. And I recall that it wasn't very long before her mum and her friends seemed to twig that there was something going on between us. And actually the Wilsons also realized that there was something happening between us. And on one occasion, Mr. Wilson very kindly allowed us to use one of the cars from the headquarters to go out for a picnic. And I think we went to Loch Lomond, to the town of Callander. Now, Joan, in her wisdom, prepared some peanut butter sandwiches for our picnic. One thing I do not like is peanut butter. I didn't say anything. So it was almost 5 busy and enriching months I spent in Scotland, and then I returned back to Buckinghamshire in the early 1977. I can't remember how or when I actually mentioned to my own family that I had met this young lady. It must have been somewhere in the period between September and Christmas 1977. My mum's younger sister was a single lady and lived a flat about a mile from our home. And on the occasions when Joan was able to visit us, she was able to stay with my auntie Gladys. And likewise, when I was visiting Joan, I was able to stay with some of her family. Now, Joan's family had a tradition of having a Boxing Day party. And in December 26, 1977, was a milestone for us. It was at that family party that I was introduced to Joan's siblings and their families. While seeking the Lord about my future, I received an invitation directly from the CLC team in Montevideo, asking me to return to Uruguay to work with them, and specifically to be involved in mobile ministry. Now, I don't know if at one of the previous meetings when I gave my testimony, years before I had been invited to go to Scotland for Aberdeen and do exactly that, a mobile trip around the north of Scotland with CLC. When I was invited to go back to Uruguay to do mobile ministry, it was just a confirmation and a wonderful way in which the Lord leads. Now, CLC was actually a part of WEC for a while, but then because it was developing into specifically a literature mission, they formed separate missions, and CLC had its own constitution and headquarters, etc. But they always maintained good working relationships and fellowships between the missions and missionaries. So although I had to go through the formal procedures of leaving WEC and joining CLC, it was fairly straightforward. I had to do all the legal paperwork and all the rest of it and do some training with CLC. And it also meant moving from the base in Bulstrode in Buckinghamshire to Upper Norwood in southeast London, where the CLC had their headquarters. Of course, right from the beginning, the missions had to know about the ongoing relationship and friendship with Joan, and they were quite understanding, but not making any commitment to what the future might be. So it was March 16, 1978, that Joan and some of other CLC workers attended my valedictory or farewell service at Cries Hill Methodist Church. And she also came to see me off at Heathrow Airport on April the 8th, 1978. To gain further experience and have fellowship with different workers within the CLC, my return was via Fort Washington in the United States and via Brazil. The first stage of the return journey was a flight from Heathrow to New York, and then I took a smaller aeroplane flight down to Philadelphia. And I remember that was quite exciting because it was a small plane and most of the way you could actually see the ground, which was quite interesting. I was met at Philadelphia Airport by Ken Adams, who was actually the founder of CLC, and he took me to the headquarters at Fort Washington in Pennsylvania. Now, the WEC and the CLC shared on the same site their mission headquarters, so over the weeks I was there, I was having fellowship and getting to know people both from WEC and CLC. So after my brief stay in the USA, I flew down to Brazil. And again, I was quite excited to get glimpses of the north of the country. The first time I went by sea, so this was a new opportunity to see South America from the air and imagine the Amazon jungle down below. John Silk, there was the one in charge of the CLC work there, and he met me in the airport at Rio de Janeiro. I had a few days there and met several of the workers, as well as visiting some of the other centers, such as San Jose and Sao Paulo. From there, I flew down to Porto Alegre and I stayed with a Brazilian family before going on to Montevideo. Now, when I got to Montevideo, I stayed with the same couple who I'd stayed with when I first arrived in Uruguay in 1970. My diary records that it was May the 20th, 1978, that I was back in Uruguay after an absence of 18 months. The CLC was the first work started in South America. It opened in 1945. It was one of the first overseas missionary centers for CLC. There were missionaries from the UK who started work in Uruguay and later in Brazil and in Chile. There was also a small work in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Further north in Colombia and Venezuela, there was work started by American missionaries. Now, in Montevideo, there was a family. The guy was from Holland and the lady from Canada. They were in the work in CLC in Montevideo with their 3 children. There were also some national workers and an elderly Armenian lady who were on the team there in Montevideo. So for a time, I lived with this family there in Montevideo. And after that, I was involved with different things. I should say that apart from CLC, there was a Bible Society, a very important Bible Society headquarters in Montevideo. There was also a Baptist bookshop just out, not quite in the center of Montevideo. There was also a Catholic bookshop in the center of Montevideo. So we were not by any means the only Christian bookshop in the town, but it was an important work. Now, while I was with WEC, I was supported financially from the UK, and there I was recognized in a sense as a voluntary worker. But when I joined CLC, because it was a business, I had to be on the payroll. So for the first time since I left work in whatever it was, I was on a payroll, being paid a salary. And as I had not driven in the country before, I had to take a driving test. And because my work would involve driving, I had to take a commercial driving license. I had to have a few practice lessons driving around, and then I had to take the exams, the test. In fact, the tests were in 3 stages. There was a medical, which actually included eyesight and also dental checkup. If you needed a filling in your tooth or anything, you couldn't get any further with your application for a driving license until it was fixed. I just the thinking was if you got bad toothache while you're driving, it might cause a problem. But I've never known that anywhere else, but that was part of it, the medical, eyesight and dental checkup. You also had a theory test, which was obviously questionnaire, but among other things, to get a commercial license, you had to learn all the locations of all the police stations and all the hospitals in Montevideo. You had to learn the directions of the streets. And Montevideo, like some other towns and cities, towns in South America, is a grid system. So you have almost like parallel lines both ways, that way and that way. So the main street was double file traffic. The parallel streets were one way, next one the other way, one that way, next one that way. Very, very efficient and simple way of finding your way around. You could never be more. If you've got a direction, you can know which turn, where to go. A very, very efficient, effective grid system. So I had to know all of that to pass my exam. As I was already fluent and had been in the country before, I quickly became involved with the CLC ministry. It wasn't difficult to adapt. After staying for a while in the house with a couple in Montevideo, I rented a property. The husband of the lady I was staying with, he was married to a lady from a Russian background whose family had a property in the outskirts of Montevideo, and I was able to rent a little bungalow from them and lived out there from a little way out. A colleague and I, as I said, when I was invited to go back to Uruguay, it was specifically to set up a mobile ministry. There had been some kind of visits occasionally from different workers to visit periodically around different parts of the country, but this was more specifically to establish a regular routes of a Christian literature distribution. My colleague Arturo and I, we went on to establish the first mobile circuits. We contacted as many of the local pastors and church leaders of all the denominations who were interested, gave them our plan, which was to visit every 2 months, one time leaving a stock of materials, books, Bibles, other stuff, and 2 months later to return and settle accounts, that which was sold, or replace that which was needed. A very, very efficient and welcomed ministry. Now, the first vehicle that we had was an Indio, and it was powered by a Bedford diesel engine. It was more like a Land Rover. And actually, it wasn't very dust-proof. It wasn't all that efficient and all that comfortable, but at least it was a start. A brethren guy who was a landowner, he either donated it or sold it to CLC very reasonably, so that was our first vehicle. We set off and we planned our route and told people when we were going to be in their town and what our plan was. And to be perfectly honest, to be as efficient as possible, Arturo and I used to take packed lunches with us, and sometimes we'd have a little gas picnic stove and cook our meals on the side of the road. And we were, in many ways, even prepared to sleep in the vehicle if necessary to cut down on expenses. We were very welcome, and it was a very efficient way of doing things. What we did, we prepared the stock beforehand, and we would keep out a sample, every title of every Bible, every book, and one of everything that we were carrying, whether they were posters, bookmarks, cards, or whatever they were. We'd have a selection of them as a sample, and the rest packed in the vehicle in boxes, numbered, labeled, and all the rest of it. And we would display, show the people who were interested. They would choose their stock. We would identify it, leave it all detailed, and the book agents, as we called them, would get a 10% discount. Now, I must admit that there was a very efficient system in Uruguay, that the post wasn't particularly brilliant, but most of the buses that went up the interior, you could take a parcel around to their bus depot, and probably by the next day or the same afternoon, they would deliver it to their depot in any of the towns in the country. So if we ran out of stock, we could phone up or get in touch with the bookshop. They would send it to the next town we were going to be, and we could collect it there and replace stock. So it was a very efficient way of working. So it was that this was a tremendous blessing. It was a challenge, of course. It was exhausting. I think over the first trips we planned, we probably had about 30 different people responded to book agents, and we used to visit them every 2 months. Later, the course was extended. We included other areas, and because of geographics, we actually reversed. We used to go up through the center of the country and back round the coast down by the Argentinian side. We decided to reverse it. We used to go out round the Argentinian side and down back through the middle of the country. Because of geographics and more population in the central areas, we started going up through the middle, up to the Brazilian border and back down the Argentinian side. after some months, we started a second circuit going the other side of the country and did the same thing. So in all, I used to be away for probably 8 or 10 days one month and maybe 4 or 5 days the next month, all the time, traveling around with these book mobiles. And it was a very rewarding, tiring experience. When I was back in town, I was responsible for different things in the bookshop. I did accounting, I did some of the ordering, collecting stock from the post office or from the docks, and generally being available for whatever needed doing. So, what was happening to Joan in all this time? I'm afraid you'll have to wait till next time to find out. I think what I've done in all these testimonies is not to prove that how brilliant I am. I said from the beginning, is to prove what the Lord can do with those who surrender to him. We read there that God has not chosen the mighty, the intelligent, the privileged. He's chosen the weak things, the foolish things, that the excellency of the glory might be of God. And anything that's been achieved is of God and not of my doing.